What's going on, guys? This is book club numero 6, number 6. I actually looked it up this time, so I got the number right. Hope you guys do like this series. If you do, please leave a thumbs up on the video. Subscribe if you want to. Comment, say, hey, this has been great. I enjoyed it. I hope you guys are learning some stuff. I know I am too, just going through this book myself, and I enjoy sharing it all with you. But Chapter 3, Part 2 is Euro nymphing. We talked about strike indicator versus Euro nymphing last time. The rest of Chapter 3 hones in on specifically Euro nymphing. Now, this is not a how-to tutorial on Euro nymphing for beginners. This is more tips for experienced anglers, in my opinion, because that's what I took out of it. I can make a Euro nymphing tutorial in the future if that's something you would like, so please leave a comment below if you'd like that. But these are some takeaways that I took away. I have multiple years of Euro nymphing experience. I think I've been doing it for almost 6 or 7 years now. Um, but just some tips and takeaways for those who are a little bit more experienced with Euro nymphing. So the first one is fishing upstream is best when the trout are spooky, and this kind of makes sense. You keep downstream, with their eyes, you can stay behind out of their line of sight, cast upstream to them. Fish are less likely to spook. I fished out this morning. I fished dry dropper, but when I fish dry dropper in low clear water like today, downstream, making long upstream casts, it's the same thing when you are doing the Euro stuff. Secondly, when you are doing the upstream stuff, line management is so important, and line management is important whether you're fishing upstream or up and across or directly across, especially at a farther distance. The more slack you have to pick up because you want to be tight to those flies. So whenever you get a take, you can see it, you can register it, you can set the hook quick, and that's basically it. And then with that, setting the hook, I have this written in all caps, 3 exclamation points. And it's something that I took away a lot guiding this last summer is set down stream. I get so frustrated with people that set upstream, and I explain it to them like if the current is flowing this way, a trout has to breathe by the water going in its mouth and then out through its gills. So it has to sit facing upstream. So if your drift is coming down this way, if you set upstream, you're literally pulling the fly right out of the mouth of the fish. So set downstream, hook them in the, set your hook into the fish rather than pulling it away from the fish. And just, you'll have better hookup, you'll have better land ratios. Trust me, it's frustrating. Next, you want to limit your rod movement, and this is especially at the beginning of your drift. You want to limit rod movement because if you move your tip, if you're messing around, if you overcast and you move your tip throughout the beginning of your drift, then you stop the flies from sinking. You actually pause the sink. You might even stop it altogether. You're also vulnerable at this point if you're messing around, if you're not tight, you're vulnerable to missing a take after your flies immediately hit the water. And that descending motion and even the ascending motion at the end are often triggers for the fish. And if you're not tight, if you're not ready, if you're messing with your rod tip, you're going to miss those strikes. And so, like I said earlier, the more upstream, the more farther away it is, the more you're going to have to manage your slack, and that's huge. You want to be careful. There's a hand retrieve method in the book. I just strip, oftentimes just pulling my arm way away from my rod if I have to. Just take up that slack. Make sure you're tight to those fish. And then this quote I took out from the book, it says, in order to fully cover a piece of water, your feet need to move upstream and or across repeatedly to shift different points of the U to new water. And so he talks about when you're Euro nymphing, essentially you're fishing in a hammock. So your flies go like this throughout the section that you're fishing. You have the sink, and then there's a point in the center where your flies are at the deepest. That's kind of the money spot. And then as they come up, towards the end of your drift, as they lift up, that's the other side of the U. And so what he talks about is different points of the U trigger different fish or can trigger different fish depending on the day. So even just taking half a step one way or half a step out or half a step up and out can drastically change your ability to catch a fish. And he says you want to treat each fish as an individual. What works for this fish might not necessarily work for that fish, and it might want it at a different point in the U. You might not be hitting it with the right point in the U, so make micro adjustments with your feet. This isn't even doing anything with your rig. You make micro adjustments with your feet and do that when you're fishing. Also, talking about before changing flies, before making any adjustments like that, try jigging your flies by lifting your rod tip 3 to 4 inches, and often this can induce a take when dead drifting no longer is working, or it's not working, or just to pick up some extra fish that maybe didn't fall for the dead drift. And then we go to adjusting depth with the fly. And when I first started out Euro nymphing, I noticed that I fish flies a lot heavier than I do now, and that's on purpose. I think when you're first starting out Euro nymphing, you want to fish flies too heavy because you're not super good at tuck casting, you're not super good at getting your flies deep, and you want to be down towards the bottom. But you can do that without ever changing your fly or adding split shot by doing a couple of different things. You can change your casting length. The farther you cast away, more time your flies have to sink. Shorter you cast away, less time stays shallower, higher up in the column. You can change your sighter angle. So if you have a more vertical sighter, if your sighter is more up and down, then you're able to fish much deeper water than if your sighter is like this. This actually, you can use heavier flies in shallow water by keeping your sighter kind of at a very sharp angle to the water. You can also change your sighter elevation and how much tippet you have. Just by if your sighter stops here, your colored piece of line, and your tippet's so far below it, just lift your sighter up higher to cover shallow. You can drop it in deeper to fish deeper water. You can also change the entry angle of your flies. This comes from tuck casting, which is kind of an advanced thing. I can't really show you, but essentially you stop your rod high so that your flies basically plummet down into the water. They get deeper quicker, and you can go lower your rod tip, the more line will smack the water, and the more slower, the slower your flies will sink. And then lastly, talks about dealing with wind, and this for a Euro nympher is the bane of a Euro nympher's existence is wind. And so one of the few things you can do while you're still Euro nymphing in the wind, you can change methods altogether, which I do recommend at some points, but Euro nymphing often in some water types is the most effective method. So these are some things to combat it. You can use heavier flies. What this does is this counteracts the kind of the arc or the sag that the wind is creating in your leader, in your indicator. It kind of straightens out more. So just upping your fly weight. You can also lower your rod closer to the water. That way you have less leader exposed, so the wind has less of a surface to take it. A little less, you can be tighter, closer to the flies. And then lastly, you can fish upstream. The more upstream you fish than across, the more, if you're fishing like this, there's less surface area for the wind to hit than if you're fishing like this. You can just see the difference in my hand where you're only seeing my front hand. If that's your sighter, that's the only part of the sighter that's seeing the wind. If you're like this, all of this sighter and this backhand are getting taken by the wind. So the more upstream you fish in the wind, the less it will impact you. So those are just some tips. Those are takeaways from chapter 3. Like I said, really enjoyed this. Hope you guys learned something. We'll see you in the next one.